This next book is by a famous British literary theorist that isn't quite literary theory, but I guess still applies to the history of literature, specifically Shakespeare. Um, his name is Frank Kermode. He died a couple of years ago, I think. Wrote wonderful essays and wonderful books and was a really insightful critic. This one is called The Age of Shakespeare, which he wrote for. This is a modern library in print. Actually, it's called the Modern Library Chronicles. It's one of their books. They write they write they put out books, I should say, on all different kinds of things: communism, feminism, fascist Italy. Um, A.N. Wilson wrote one on London. There's one on the Holocaust. Gordon Wood wrote one on the American Revolution. I mean, sort of big idea type of series. I found the Modern Library Chronicles books to be somewhat of a mixed bag, to be honest. Um, Hans Kung wrote one for the series called The Catholic Church, A Short History, and Stephen Kotkin wrote another one, which I just reviewed yesterday, actually, called Uncivil Society, 1989 and the Implosion of the Communist Establishment, which, like I said, I reviewed, and I found those two to be very good, full of information for people with all kinds of backgrounds, especially non-technical, non-academic backgrounds. The Age of Shakespeare, however, I found to be written for an audience who has little to no knowledge of late 16th century and early 17th century English culture and politics. And if that's you, then I think you'll probably enjoy this book a little bit more than I did. But because of that, it plotted a little bit for me. It may be the case that the varying quality can be attributed to the word limits imposed on the authors. I think they all hover around 200 pages or so, excluding any ancillary notes or bibliographical material at the end. Many good introductory sources require a book anywhere between 2 and 3 times this long, especially when the times were as complicated as Shakespeare's were. This could have been a better book had it been on just the history of Elizabethan or Jacobean England itself. But as I want to talk about below, Kermode chose to make much of the book about Shakespeare's life and work. And I understand the whole book is to talk about the age of Shakespeare, but he adds so much that's Shakespeare specific to it. His, like I said, his life and his work and his the staging of his plays, etc. That it leaves it feeling very, I guess, confused and sort of like it's trying to touch on everything without covering any one thing well. None of this is to say that Kermode doesn't manage to distill some really good information in a very small number, page-wise. The early chapters do a really good job of emphasizing the various changes of Catholicism to Anglicanism under Henry VIII, and then back to Catholicism under Mary, and then back to Protestantism under Elizabeth, and particularly how those changes manifested themselves in many of Shakespeare's plays, most of which never seemed far removed from inherently political concerns. Kermode is always really honest and admits most of what we know about Shakespeare's early life is purely speculative. For example, did he come to London seeking the patronage of Henry Wriothesley, the Earl of Southampton, or did the Jesuit and later the martyr Edmund Campion discreetly pass Catholic literature on to William and his father John when William was young? We don't really know, at least at this point. The possibilities are interesting to think about, but again are ultimately conjecture. He also traces the really incredible rise in the place of the playwright as a subtopic in several of the book's chapters, from the liminality of the unsavory vagabond during Elizabeth's reign to really the reverence and the honor that had been gained by many playwrights by the time of the early part in James I's reign. So this is just maybe, a couple of decades, and the place of the playwright completely changes from the end of the 16th century to the beginning of the 17th. Some of the best information is the background provided about the Rose, Globe, and Blackfriars theaters, their construction, the various people that were responsible for writing and producing the plays, and the kinds of audiences that frequented these theaters. The chapters that suffer the most are the longest ones, which happen to be the ones which cover Shakespeare's plays. It seems like Kermode is racing as fast as he possibly can to cover at least half a page or so on every play, which he manages to do, but as I said earlier, it seems like he's more after quantity of information than the quality of it. However, as I mentioned above, none of what he says really sticks, and that's probably why. Instead, we get randomly introduced tidbits, interesting as though they are. He tells us that in Titus Andronicus, Shakespeare carefully interrelates the ideas of humor and social taboo, and that the influence of Terence and Plautus is easily discerned in the Comedy of Errors, and that Bottom echoes, if not directly copies, St. Paul's "Eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him," from 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 9, in Midsummer Night's Dream. There's no rhyme or reason as to why he includes these pieces of information over other pieces. Many books need not be as long as they are, but I think this one should have been much longer, especially if he's going to try to do textual analysis of the plays in addition to telling you about Shakespeare's times. The first half of the book is worth the introduction to the England of the time. And I would say the second half of the book can easily be skipped over if you're interested in a topic like this. There's just too many other good supplements out there, including Mark Van Doren's Shakespeare, which is a book of essays covering each one of the plays, Auden's lectures, Northrop Frye, who also wrote somewhat extensively on Shakespeare, or if you're feeling particularly reactionary, you can always opt for Harold Bloom's Shakespeare, the Invention of the Human, which I rather enjoy, actually. I don't agree with everything he says, but his essays are always nice and contentious to read. The Age of Shakespeare by Frank Kermode.